All right, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give everyone who's attending right now a second to settle in, let any last-minute stragglers come in before we get started today. All right, so let's get started here. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to another webinar in our Green Infrastructure webinar series. Today's session is on navigating the green infrastructure policy landscape. My name is Shannon Sloan Pepper. I'm with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be your host for this and other webinars in the series. The series is made possible with funding from the US EPA under a grant aimed at helping rural, small, and tribal communities and wastewater treatment systems access funding. The goal here is compliance with the Clean Water Act to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution in our waters. We're also getting programmatic support from an awesome Albuquerque-based coalition called Arid LID. Before we begin, I'm going to go over just a few logistics. So during the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We'll be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, we will receive a follow-up email that includes the link to the webinar recording, as well as any other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today, as well as the series flyer in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Slides will also contain URLs to the resources that presenters will link to. On the screen here are some instructions for how to open that control panel. And if you need any more assistance, please just go ahead and shout it out in the chat, and one of us will jump in and assist you. So this webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits. However, eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. So to receive a certificate for the session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and a unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have any questions or need any assistance, please go ahead and contact smallsystems@syr.edu. That link is at the bottom of the screen there. So a little bit about us now. The Environmental Finance Center Network, of which my organization, the Southwest EFC, is part of, provides training and technical assistance to small water, wastewater, and stormwater systems in all US states and territories through our capacity building programs. If your community or utility needs any assistance with drinking water, wastewater, or stormwater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which we'll be sharing in the chat shortly. So our intention with this webinar series is to highlight the ways that effective planning, implementation, and maintenance of green infrastructure demands partnerships across departments and disciplines. And this requires us as organizers of the series to also look to our colleagues in planning, engineering, policy, landscape architecture, geography, community organizations. Really, the list goes on. And we want to also reach academics, practitioners, as well as students. So here's an overview of our webinar schedule. We'll be doing these approximately quarterly. This is the third in the series. So make sure to check back on the EFCN website for updated event pages as we get closer to each webinar release. You can also sign up for email updates at the link that Kristen will drop in the chat. Each webinar is recorded too, so you can watch either the live or the recorded versions. The recordings will be posted to the event page for each webinar and will also be available on the EFCN YouTube channel. So I'm going to do a quick overview of today's webinar. Brief recap, what is green infrastructure. That's just going to be a really quick and dirty reminder if you haven't attended one of these webinars before, or if you have and want just to make sure that we're all on the same page with what we're talking about when we talk about green infrastructure. Then we'll have a presentation by Councilor Tammy Fiebelkorn on Albuquerque's GSI policy journey. We'll look at green infrastructure at a national and state scale, looking at policy opportunities with Pete Hill. Then we'll go over just a few additional resources for you all, and we'll finally have a question and answer session at the end of today's session. I'm hoping to have about at least 10 or 15 minutes for that question and answer session, so make sure you stick around for that. And I would like to also introduce our presenters for today at this moment. Hi, I'm Shannon Pepper. Again, I am a trainer and technical assistance provider with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. We're a nonprofit research and service organization for water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. We are housed at the University of New Mexico, based in Albuquerque. Tammy Fiebelkorn is our other presenter today. She's been representing District 7 on the Albuquerque City Council since 2022. During her tenure there, she has championed initiatives that are focused on environmental protection, sustainability, equity, affordable housing, and animal welfare. Professionally, Tammy works with Western Research Advocates, where she develops policies to safeguard New Mexico's land and water while promoting clean energy solutions. Additionally, Tammy has served on the New Mexico Code Change Committee and has actively lobbied for decarbonization at the state legislature. She's also created educational materials on climate resilience and environmental policy. In 2020, she received the Climate Conservation Award from the Climate Change Leadership Institute. Tammy holds degrees in economics and finance from Northeast Louisiana University and a master's degree in natural resource economics from Colorado State. And then our next speaker, Pete Hill, has implemented and advised on green infrastructure for most of his career. For the past several years as a consultant, he helped municipalities and nonprofit organizations in the Great Lakes region with watershed planning and workforce development and training related to green infrastructure. Prior to that, he worked for the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment, managing the implementation of stormwater projects and stream and wetland restoration projects with a focus on the Anacostia River. Pete is committed to realizing the benefits that green infrastructure promises and ensuring equitable access to clean rivers and livable communities. And then my colleague at Syracuse EFC, Kristen will be in the background behind the scenes, running the chat and the polls, and also helping to field questions for the speakers. So you might hear from Kristen Crew as well. All right, so let's hear a little bit about you all now. We'd like to get a sense of who's attending the webinar today. So could you please indicate when the poll pops up, which of the following categories best applies to you in your work? So Kristen, you can go ahead and launch that poll.
All right, poll is launched.
Yeah, so please just go ahead and pick whatever category best applies to you in your work. Are you a citizen or community group? Are you a water or wastewater or stormwater utility? Maybe a public works employee or a contractor? Are you elected or state official? Planner, designer, or engineer, or an environmental nonprofit? And it could be that you fall under multiple categories, but whatever hat you want to put on today for this webinar, go ahead and just mark that option.
All right, go ahead and get your answers in. I'll be closing the poll in just a couple of seconds. All right, closing the poll right now. All right, Shannon, so we have a variety of different people here with us today. So the most, 27%, we have elected official and policy folks following, oh wait, I'm sorry, the most at 30%, we have planner, designers, and engineers. Following that, we have elected officials and policy folks. Third, we have the public works, but we do have a little bit of everything in the room with us today.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for participating in that poll. And that gives me a sense of who we're talking to today. And it's really great to see representation from all of these different groups. All right, so So we can go ahead and close that poll now. Okay, so before we get into our main presentations for today, I'm just going to do a really quick recap of green infrastructure. Just make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about green infrastructure here. So I'm going to go over the basics of green infrastructure, how it relates to water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. If this is the first webinar in the series that you're attending, please know that you can also view the full version of our first webinar, which was recorded and is now hosted on the EFCN website and on YouTube. So for those of you who are returning, I'll keep this as brief as possible, just a few minutes here. So what makes green infrastructure such a compelling water management option for communities of all sizes? So when thinking about words like water infrastructure, most people associate to things like pipes, concrete lined drainage ditches, or treatment plants. Infrastructure assets that are primarily made from concrete and steel. So then what are we talking about with the green part? What do we actually mean by green? So there's no universal or official definition of green infrastructure. For the purpose of the series, I'll break it down this way. So with green infrastructure, we're talking about water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure that integrates natural systems like plant growth, the water cycle, and soil filtration as part of the function of the infrastructure. So we're talking about beyond just bacterial and biochemical processes usually used in wastewater treatment plants. So this could look like a vegetated swale, a rain garden, or a wetland, which could either be constructed or naturally occurring. Now, from these pictures, it might seem like I'm creating some kind of dichotomy like green versus gray, but actually in most cases, we advocate using both of these types of infrastructure, and we really need them to work together to achieve their full potential. So let's go over a quick example here. Green and gray infrastructure that share a function but look a bit different on the ground. So here we have concrete sewer pipes whose function is the conveyance of storm water from roads and buildings, away from roads and buildings. And its green counterpart is an infiltration trench. This one is situated along a roadway. And we have some added or co-benefits to the infiltration trench. That could be filtration of water through the soil, which allows plants and fungi in the trench to break down pollutants that are associated with the adjacent roadway, like heavy metals, oils, and that kind of thing. This is a feature that the community can enjoy walking along as well, with plants that cool the air and improve air quality, as well as capturing carbon and other airborne materials in the process. So if you're still feeling confused about what green infrastructure is and what it can look like at different scales, it makes sense. It's a big concept. Please make sure to watch the first webinar in our series. It's more of a general overview and gives a lot more examples of what green infrastructure can look like. So why are we advocating for green infrastructure? This is also green infrastructure can also be called nature-based solutions, green stormwater infrastructure. Low impact development is a little bit different, but it has a lot of different names, associated names. So a big reason why we're here today really is about climate resiliency. So much of our current infrastructure was built with a really different idea of what a 100-year storm might look like. And here in New Mexico, for example, that can look like longer periods of drought followed by deluges of precipitation, far outside historical norms on both aspects. Much of our aging sewer infrastructure is not built to handle that kind of volume of water, and we are losing much of that valuable fresh rainwater as runoff. And green infrastructure at all scales can capture, slow, and filter stormwater where it falls. That reduces the burden on our centralized treatment plants and also simultaneously improves water quality by treating the water before it returns to the sources that we use for drinking, such as river, groundwater, etc. And these are just a couple of benefits of green infrastructure. There are some key elements to green and natural infrastructure that make it particularly good at managing and treating water in the environment, and which give it a wide range of co-benefits for humans and wildlife. This can look like increased habitat for wildlife, improved air quality, improved mental health of community members, benefiting the watershed and everyone downstream. It can also look like bioremediation, which is treating water and reducing the burden on gray infrastructure and treatment facilities, sort of on site. Green infrastructure can also be cheaper in the long run than building and maintaining gray infrastructure. And then let's talk about partnerships. So here in the US, in both law and then down to the community level, drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems are really built and managed as separate from one another, even though all water on Earth is part of the same system, the water cycle, right? But often there is limited understanding of how to fund and implement green infrastructure because it really demands cross-disciplinary, cross-department collaboration in order to be successful. And then there's also a big city bias. Green infrastructure is not just for urban areas, though. It can address environmental and public health issues in small, rural, and tribal communities too. And in some ways, these communities are actually really well suited to green infrastructure projects because often we don't see the same kinds of divides and silos between different departments or universities in small and rural places. People are usually better used to talking to each other and working together. And that's often the biggest hurdle that we find with implementing green infrastructure. And we'll go a little bit more into that today, especially as we talk about development of policy. So, I mean, you can make all sorts of plans to install green infrastructure in your home and your community and your region. But if the policy currently in place doesn't support green infrastructure, then you're not going to make it really that far. Policy is sort of like the frame of a house. It both limits what's possible in terms of what you build, but it also creates the space for whatever it is that you want to build inside of it. And it's a crucial part of the process of designing and implementing green infrastructure. If you're facing policy barriers when you're planning for green infrastructure, it's important to get familiar with the state of green infrastructure policy at different scales. So what is being allowed or encouraged or restricted at a national scale or a state level could really have broad implications for any work that you do with green infrastructure. But then it's also important to tune into what's happening locally in your area. Are there any city, town, or county ordinances related to green infrastructure that are currently being developed or that are going to appear on a ballot? So our first presenter, Albuquerque City Councilor Tammy Fiebelkorn, is going to open this conversation by sharing with us her knowledge and experience while creating and advocating for green infrastructure policy at a local scale here in Albuquerque. So Councilor Fiebelkorn, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me to talk about what we've done in Albuquerque as kind of a case study. Hopefully folks can learn a little bit from us. We are the largest city in our state, but we are in the West and we have smaller cities than most. But Albuquerque is moving along on our green stormwater infrastructure policy journey, and I'll just talk you through kind of what we've done and then also what we need to be doing as our next step. So go ahead to the next slide. So we had a little bit of a head start on policy because back in 2014, before I was on council, they passed a complete streets ordinance. Now this does not include GSI originally, but it was really the first time that our city and a lot of cities that pass the complete streets ordinance, it's the first time you start thinking through how to do kind of localized median landscape buffer, making streets complete. Now the point of the complete streets is to make sure that streets have bikes and crossings for pedestrians, but we included in that some things around landscaping and medians. And so that was our first foray into this level of policy development. And then a few years later, the City Council did an integrated development ordinance. Now, this is where we talk about how all of our zoning comes together. And in that, we started putting additional requirements, even for commercial and private spaces, on landscaping and trees and things like that. And so when I took office, it was we had a little bit of a start there, and we were able to say, look, we already have this complete streets ordinance, but we would like to incorporate green stormwater infrastructure into that ordinance. And our goal here was not for the very large projects that Shannon was talking about, but really thinking of creative ways to keep water where it lands, right? If it's raining, wherever it comes down, that's where we want to keep it. So we want to make sure we're utilizing every median, every landscape buffer on streets, all of those areas that we have purview over in the complete streets ordinance. We want to make sure we're including green stormwater infrastructure. So next slide. So we did just pass that inclusion, and it was a really big step for Albuquerque. I was very proud of it. But I think it's important when you're thinking about policy to think through not only what is included, but what were we not able to include. So I just copied and pasted in the next slide, go ahead, to show you some of the parts of this bill. It's pretty long. We have a link that we can put in the chat for everyone to see the whole entire bill. But I thought I would just go through kind of the big picture, the heart of the legislation that we passed. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was the definition. And I think Shannon mentioned there's not one kind of accepted definition of green stormwater infrastructure. And boy, is that true. This went through 12 revisions. And so we had a lot of folks that had differing opinions on what this should be. I will not read this to you, but this is what Albuquerque came up with. In terms of what our definition for stormwater and green stormwater infrastructure should be. And I think it's good. We had some of the best experts working through this with us. So I'm very happy with the definition that we came on. And then the next slide goes into kind of what we said we're going to do. And we actually said specifically, where we should use this. Now, I highlighted a yellow part here that does, it's one of those things, anytime you start with a piece of legislation, you think it's perfect, but amendments are needed to get it through. And one of the things that we had to do in here is say, we're going to use GSI whenever we're doing all these things. And then to get it passed, we had to say, to the extent practicable. So that's a little bit of a wavering statement, not one that I would love to see in any of my policies, but it was absolutely necessary to get it through the system. And we do have now this base for GSI in the city of Albuquerque. So we might not see it in every single, for example, median redo, but we will see it in all new medians and all new landscape buffers and all of those areas that we would not have seen it before. So I'm overall very happy, but want to point out some of the things that happen when you're working on policy, and it gets to this level where you have to put in some clauses that you might not love. But we said that, and then we gave some specifics about, what we're going to do with this green stormwater infrastructure. And the first one was that all of these features should be depressed to collect the water, which to me seemed like an obvious one, but I will tell you that that one got a lot of pushback. The understanding from other electeds and from other folks was lacking on this one, and they just were afraid that everything was going to look like a big hole, and we had to show them all the examples of what GSI can look like, and we were able to keep that in there, but that was a little bit of a pressure point. Next slide. So we also said that we're going to do it on all new roadways and all roadways that are being rehabilitated, which is a really good start for any policy, but GSI in particular. And then we said that if it's not going to be infiltrated there, it's going to be directed to the local, the closest storm drain system for overflow. We talked about how we're going to do that. Go ahead, go to the next slide. And then this last one was interesting. We really had to add in number 5. There was just a lot of concern around maintenance, and I do understand this, and I'm glad we added this in. This is a new thing for Albuquerque. We have not had kind of these smaller, localized green stormwater infrastructure projects en masse, and there is a lot of concern around, is our Department of Municipal Development going to be able to maintain these as we get many, many, many infrastructure projects in place? And that is something that we are working through. So putting that into the ordinance, I think, was really important, that we're going to use the design to make sure it's easy to maintain, so that we're not setting up the city for failure. And by the city, I mean everyone who lives here who's going to benefit from these green stormwater infrastructures. So next slide. Those are just some of the things that were in the legislation that I wanted to make sure I talked to you a little bit about. But I wanted to start about like thinking through what were the building blocks to get that policy passed. And I think these are similar to what you would experience in any other city. But of course, you know, Albuquerque is a unique place and everyone else's city is as well. But I think there's some commonality here that we can think through. The first thing that you absolutely positively needed was expertise. And in Albuquerque and in New Mexico, we are very, very lucky because we have, and you've already heard about them from Shannon, but we have the Arid LID Coalition that is based here in New Mexico and has hundreds of members that are experts in all things green stormwater infrastructure. And so they jumped on board and really helped us not only think through how to write this policy, but then really helped us with implementation and explaining this to various folks so we could get the support we needed. So if you don't have expertise in your community, it's just reaching out to someone like Arid LID for some assistance. We also were very lucky in Albuquerque in that we have staff at our Department of Municipal Development that are very interested in green stormwater infrastructure. In fact, several of our staff members are members of the Arid LID Coalition. So that really did make it easy as well, because we had, you know, you're gonna have to get your staff on board, and we already had several staff members who were big cheerleaders for this concept to begin with. So that was really nice. Public support. You know, nothing passes a local city council without some public support. And this one was really interesting because we saw a lot of folks say they really like this idea for a lot of the co-benefits that Shannon talked about a little bit, not as much about the benefits that we're all thinking of, which is, you know, stormwater management and water quality. But we had folks that were saying, like, we love this shade idea. We love the wildlife habitat. We love the narrowing of the streets for the bump outs for some of these kinds of projects. So we really had a variety of support mechanisms that were really nice to see people coming out and talking about. I think it's really important when you propose a piece of legislation like this that you have some timeliness. And we unfortunately had the perfect timing in Albuquerque because we have been seeing more and more flooding in our residential areas, particularly in 3 council districts, one of them being mine. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that we built our stormwater management system in the 50s, and we've grown since then, but the management system hasn't. But also we've decreased the amount of permeable space in our communities because of all the parking lots on the streets and also even areas like backyards are kind of tamped down, so it's really not permeable anymore. So we've seen those things come together with climate change, and we've seen more flooding. So as people are flooding and you're seeing that in the news and you're hearing that from constituents, putting forward a proposal like this that says this is a part of the solution to reducing that amount of flooding was really helpful in getting it passed. And that's what helped get us the elected official support. So, you know, you need all of these to get basically any policy passed, but specifically on green stormwater infrastructure, because it's kind of a new concept and people aren't prepared to really have an opinion on it until you get them there. So next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the political support, which was the last thing on that last slide, and how we did that in Albuquerque, which might be helpful to folks. First, start early and go slow. This is a very new concept to almost everyone I spoke to on council and, you know, the higher ups. And so I really did want to really get the concept out there before we proposed an actual bill and get folks thinking through what this is and how it would help. Again, show the electeds the need. As I mentioned, we have flooding in 3 of our districts. And so, well, probably more than 3, but these 3 are right next to each other, and it's something that we can collaboratively work on. So I really went to those 2 other counselors, you know, said, look, we've got to go out here. We've got to see what's happening. We've showed pictures. We've done walkthroughs right after the rain. It was, you know, really mortifying to see people's yards flooded and really close to getting into their house. And so that need really, really does spur on elected officials because we just want to help our constituents, right? And working collaboratively. Again, I took the lead, but there are 3 councilors that were on this bill with me because I thought it was important that we show bipartisan support. And so I started 2 years before we actually proposed this legislation. I started negotiating for some funding for green stormwater infrastructure and got it into our capital budget. But I made sure that it wasn't for District 7. I put it into a fund that was available for all 3 of those districts. With the concept being, you know, water doesn't know district lines, and we shouldn't either. We should be putting the money where it's needed. And so having that kind of background of having brought in resources, having shared that across districts really did help get the bipartisan support. And like I said, we had 3 councilors that supported this legislation and sponsored it, and they were bipartisan. So I think that was very, very helpful. Go ahead to the next slide. So we now have that in place, right? We have our GSI requirements in our Complete Streets Ordinance. It's great. I'm very excited. We're redesigning our design guide right now so that in the future, as projects come up, all of that is included. It's really, really exciting. We have some next steps that we need to do because our journey's not over. We have a pilot project happening in my district. I'm very, very proud of it. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. But we've also decided to go and do some revamping of existing bump outs around the city that are not in my district, but I think it's important to show everywhere how nice and pretty these can be. So we're doing that. I was able to negotiate and use my council directed sponsorship to have a GSI expert on contract with the city. And again, that's the leader of the Airedale ID Coalition. And I think you've heard from her on one of these presentations before, Sarah Hertuff. So really excited to have that contract in place so that all departments can get the assistance they need to kind of understand GSI, but also if they have a project, get assistance with the design or any aspect of it. So that's really nice. And then again, we need more policy. Go ahead to the next slide. Before I get to the next to the policy needs, I do want to just brag a moment about the pilot project that's happening in District 7. We have 2 neighborhoods that are experiencing quite a bit of flooding. You can see there's pictures after just a recent flood, and it's pretty bad. The streets are flooded, the yards are flooded. It's pretty bad, and we think that's been really helpful in a really sad way in getting support for this concept. But this is one street where there's going to be 3 blocks of GSI bump outs. And we've done an award-winning campaign with the neighborhood to get their input down to the level of each neighborhood got to choose their own plant palette for what's going to be installed. And this installation process should start soon. We've raised all the funds and we've gone through years of public outreach, education, and design. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the other neighborhood, which is right next to this one. And they're slightly different plant palettes that they chose. But again, it's just a really exciting project. And my goal is to not have this be the last one. This is just the first of many, many, many of these that we need to really have a collective giant impact on the amount of water that's rushing through our streets and into people's yards. So next slide. So one of the things that, going back to the policy and what additional policy do we need, one of the things that really has been a problem for me and for others that are working on these kind of policies, and it's the same whether it's green stormwater infrastructure or just climate policy in general, is that we need to make sure that we get the benefits of these kind of programs to low-income, underserved communities, because equity does matter. And so we find that low-income folks are also living in geographic locations that are the most impacted by the need. You know, they generally live at the bottom of the hill. One of the neighborhoods that you just saw the markup for, literally in the 1950s, was an arroyo. And the city closed off that arroyo and filled it in, but obviously all around it, the surrounding area still thinks of that as a place for water to flow. And so we really just need to make sure that when we are designing programs of any sort, any kind of policy, that we're thinking about ways to get benefits to those areas that are geographically disadvantaged. Climate impacts are higher there. These folks don't have the ability to fund their own improvements. So there's a need for government intervention there. Go to the next slide. So that's where I'm at. I'm thinking through ways to make sure that our next policy moves do what we need to do to increase the efficiency and the effectiveness of green stormwater infrastructure while making sure that the benefits get to all of our citizens. And so things that we're considering and trying to work around is, we have new versus existing. Our existing law, the one that we just talked about, talks about new and major renovations of roads. So that's great. Moving forward, we're going to do things right. But how do we go back and make sure that all the existing construction, roads, developments, how do we get the benefits to them? The other thing we're kind of struggling with is incentives versus regulation. We can regulate, we did that with the Complete Streets Ordinance, but I'd love to be able to offer additional incentives to folks to do things on their own personal property, because the more we can keep it on the property where it lands, the better off. And then we also have to think about the public versus private partnership, or the public versus private locations in the city, and think through, right now I can do a lot of things on public property, but how do we incentivize private property? It's a question that we don't know the answer to, and I don't know if anybody else is from Albuquerque or from New Mexico, but in New Mexico, we have a pretty stringent anti-donation clause, which makes doing anything on private property somewhat tricky. So that's something that we're having to think about. So next slide. So we have done this already. We have formed a working group. We've started meetings. We are thinking through kind of what are those things that we just talked about can we do now? How can we get more money for green stormwater infrastructure? And then we're going to develop an additional policy proposal that will hopefully move us even further along than we have right now with our GSI and our Complete Streets Ordinance. So with that, I think I will stop talking, and we'll be hearing from others on this webinar, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, if you go to the next slide, you'll have my contact information. If you have any questions after the webinar, you're always welcome to reach out directly. Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Tammy. It's really great to hear from someone who's really working on this policy stuff on the ground and really moving some of this legislation forward. You're a great advocate in our community, and it's really great to hear from you. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and ask Kristen to launch another poll. This is going to be a poll related to what Tammy was talking about. And I'm just really curious to hear from everyone who's on the webinar here today, if in your community or in a community that you're working with, does your town or city or county have any green infrastructure ordinances or legislation that you know of? And if you do know of any, or if you have legislation that you know is in the works, could you just put a note in the chat with a little bit of information about that ordinance, or links to it if you have them? Again, this is optional, but I would just be really curious to hear from everyone here about any local GSI green infrastructure ordinance.
All right, the poll is launched and most people have answered, but I'll give everyone about 10 more seconds. All right, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, so the majority of people, almost 60%, are not sure. And then it's a tie between yes and no. 21% of people are saying yes, that they know of ordinances or legislation happening in their community, and another 21% do not know. of any ordinances or legislation happening in their community or one that they are working with.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for responding. I think I'll have at the end of this presentation, I'll share a resource that might be helpful for those of you who are not sure what the state of green stormwater infrastructure legislation is in your community. There's some really great online tools that you can use to do basically an audit of your community's infrastructure ordinances. But before that, I am going to move into our next presentation here. Pete Hill will zoom out a bit and give us a little bit broader overview of green infrastructure policy and opportunities and challenges at a state and national scale. So Pete, you can go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks Shannon. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks to the Syracuse and Southwest EFCs for hosting this, and I was really excited to hear Shannon and Tammy, your presentations. I hadn't heard them before, so I was just really excited to see how closely they tie into some of the things I'm going to be discussing. So as you mentioned, I'm going to be pulling the lens back a little bit and talking about things a little more broadly. But first, you can go to the next slide. Go ahead. Just a little bit about EPIC. If you haven't heard of us, we're a team of experts in engineering, science, water, business, all over the country, with a singular focus on using policy to speed up environmental and public health progress. We don't work alone. We build collaborative partnerships with a network of people and groups, most often people in government, to make this happen. Next slide. And we work in different areas. I'm in the water team, but as you can imagine, green infrastructure touches on a few of these. So our internal collaboration is key to our effectiveness. Next slide. So today I'm going to describe what constitutes a national green stormwater infrastructure policy, such as it is. I'll describe some of the drivers that affect implementation, where we are today as a result of some of these drivers, some promising developments that EPIC and others have been working on, some ideas of how we might be able to create policy levers that could speed up those changes on the local level. We know these are critical to realizing the multiple benefits that GSI promises. Next slide. So my talk today is by definition describing something in flux, given that the practice is evolving, but also that there really isn't a national policy on green infrastructure. What we have is an abundance of guidance, resource documents, tools, technical assistance, and funding programs. These are fantastic resources and show that knowledge is spreading throughout federal agencies and best practices are being shared nationally. This document from the White House focused on nature-based solutions, but also has a lot about green infrastructure, is a good example, lots of great examples. But when I think about policy, I think about levers and specifically how we can create a system of incentives that help drive the local and policy ordinance changes that Tammy described. And it's difficult to do to limitations on federal oversight on local decision-making. My background, I spent many years implementing green infrastructure on the local level and realized that the most significant issues are some of those pesky local issues like coordination, ordinances, technical standards that can allow implementers to move forward with certainty, or in many cases, the opposite. Public support is key for acceptance of changed public space. There are policy levers, they're not usually specific to GSI, but levers that drive investments that can include GSI. And these are the sort of drivers that have driven implementation to date. Most significantly, they're regulatory. Most of the best known urban GSI efforts were at least started or driven by CSO consent decrees. Administrative rules and priorities have had some impact, and of course, funding is a huge driver. The strength and the specificity of the requirements tied to funding have big impact upon whether GSI is prioritized and ultimately funded. And I'm going to circle back on this last point at the end of the talk. So diving a little bit more into these drivers, we have strong ones, we've got weak ones. The strong ones, these CSO consent decrees that many cities are working to address, have really created a mandate to at least consider GSI as part of the solution for the volume control. we're familiar with some of these great examples. It's just important to note that they wouldn't have taken place without this regulatory hammer. Chesapeake Bay TMDL is another great example of how enforceable TML. A TMDL has driven really impressive green stormwater implementation in this watershed at a rate not really matched elsewhere in the U.S. Some weak drivers are most of the MS4 permits, excluding those in the Bay region, where not many really include a requirement for implementation or retrofits. Another example is the Green Project Reserve related to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which encourages states to direct at least 10% of funds to, quote, green infrastructure, water, energy efficiency, other environmental beneficial projects subject to available projects. And in most cases, this is something that we've been looking at closely. It's preferable for states to achieve this by including energy or water efficiency components into wastewater treatment projects. And many of these are beneficial, but it often leaves green stormwater infrastructure playing kind of second fiddle. It's also challenging to compare the relative benefits. These are energy versus water, these kind of expenditures. Many states don't receive applications for green infrastructure projects, in part because of the administrative burden associated with SRFs, but in big part a lack of clarity of what the deal is, how much will be a loan versus how much might be awarded as a grant. But regardless, most municipalities, unless required, don't want to take out loans for these kind of projects. Next slide, please. So looking at federal funding, and this is not a complete list by any means, but just some big buckets. It's exciting to think about the potential, and all of these funding pots list GSI as a desired project type. So if you were to do the math and just take 5% of that, that's a huge amount of money that could be directed towards green infrastructure. Next slide. But what we're seeing is that this is for SRFs particularly, that's not really happening. There's a very small amount that's going to green stormwater infrastructure. Some different reasons, some I mentioned, but I think we also need to recognize this business environment in which the work is being funded. Like most wastewater treatment plants are supported by a robust network of consulting engineers who supply projects. So in most cases, it's just simply easier to plan for a wastewater treatment system upgrade. And in most cases, these are justifiable and necessary. But on the other hand, green infrastructure frequently doesn't have these plans on the shelf. And as we know, as was mentioned, they require community engagement, coordination with other city and government agencies, many times changes to ordinances, ideally engagement with, urban planning and business development efforts. So it kind of puts green stormwater infrastructure on the back burner. You can go ahead, if you would. Next slide. Some states are further ahead along in this path. As you can see, this was from a report we did a couple years ago. And you can see some states are taking greater advantage of these SRF dollars than others. Okay, next slide. So sometimes I think of, green infrastructure as sort of this, spice that sits on the shelf. Like, if you go out and have maybe others have had this experience, you go out and have a great Indian meal, and then you're thinking, like, God, I could make this at home. But, maybe you buy the spices, but you don't get around to it because it takes more work unless you're fortunate to know how to cook or have someone who knows how in your family knows how to cook. It ends up kind of just not happening. And so obviously we don't want this to happen. So what can we do to make sure that GSI is, on an even playing field? Next slide. So where are we right now? Next slide, please. There we go. Okay, thanks. We have, green stormwater infrastructure in these vastly different contexts. This example in Seattle, the North Lake Commons, is an excellent example of a utility working with the private sector to address some maintenance concerns. They have a joint maintenance agreement. And in this case, it's allowed them to capture an additional 2 acres of public right-of-way stormwater, which is huge. So great example, but how does that really translate to, say, this community in Arkansas, where we're working with this community? It's very small, 2 employees, but they still have flooding as well. Every time it rains an inch, the entire town is flooded. How do we come up with some solutions that will work there too, with obviously a much smaller municipal workforce? Okay, next slide. So I wanted to just touch on a couple things that EPIC is doing related to green stormwater infrastructure. First of all, I'd mentioned the SRF programs. We were part of this SRF State Advocates Forum, this network, and so we engage with state SRF administrators, we submit comments, and we develop some relationships which will allow us to start the discussion of how we might change some of these state administrative rules. Next slide. Another thing we're doing is we write reports. We wrote this one on how capital costs could be incorporated into, or maintenance costs could be incorporated into capital costs, thus getting green stormwater infrastructure through that important installation or installation and kind of establishment period. So that's on our website. If you're interested, you can check that out. And some municipalities are using that and taking advantage of that. Next slide, please. We also look at CBP3s, or these community-based public-private partnerships. In many cases, they've been shown to provide additional co-benefits at a greater rate than other mechanisms, but not all states or municipalities are sort of set up to manage contracts in this way. So we're looking at examples. Washington State's one where they're supporting this kind of work, and what they're doing to, if a municipality wants to take this kind of approach, they would be able to. All right, next slide. We're also looking generally just at what states are doing to plan and support green stormwater infrastructure. The funding landscape on the state level, which I won't really go into, is very different. So some states are doing a ton, some not really much at all. So we try to highlight that. And next slide, please. Also, we're very interested in these pay for success contracts. One of my colleagues is doing a lot of work on this, and this is really important because in some places are trying this. Notably, Anne Arundel County has shown to been able to reduce unit costs for stormwater capture. Really important with those very stringent requirements related to the Bay TMDL that I mentioned. So you can look into that a little more on our website if you'd like. Next slide. So I want to get back to this idea of like what would comprise elements of a national GSI policy. First and foremost, the funding issue. Would be one component, really just setting aside a portion of all these designated targets towards disadvantaged communities where, the co-benefits could really be significant. Some states are doing some important things, like the Maryland's Conservation Finance Act, which puts GSI at a level playing field with gray infrastructure. Next slide. But I think the big thing is, how do we drive some of these things that Tammy talked about that Albuquerque is doing in such an impressive way? How do we drive these sort of things, which we know are key to making green infrastructure not only just sort of, it's easier to implement, but also will boost these co-benefits. And these look different in different places, but I think in many cases we kind of provide money and then sort of some good advice and hope people are going to go ahead and good luck with all this. It's a lot of work, but how could we really incentivize those things to happen prior to the funding? Next slide. So this got me thinking, like with a green roof, we know these components are all part of, ideally part of a project, and similar to a green roof, with multiple layers, these things, we hope they're under the sedum there. These elements are there, ensuring that the project is sustainable and meets all these other benefits. Next slide. So what could this look like, or what would be a format for this? We know that we can't enforce these policy changes, but some communities are going ahead, and should we acknowledge them? Should we acknowledge the work that Albuquerque is doing? This work also is kind of runs on a spectrum. It's not a checkbox. It's there's a process, so it could be amenable to sort of a rating system, and in a way, wouldn't it make sense to sort of tie the cost share amount to the presence of these factors, given the fact that, the more of them that are included, the more beneficial and the more effective these dollars will be. So it's really kind of looking beyond this kind of check mark, or more specifically, just looking at a project, the project designs, what the water quality or quantity benefits may be, the technical standards of that. We know those are important, but we know all these other things are really important too. And how can we, I say drive communities here, but in some cases it might be acknowledge or just support communities to do these things that they're trying to do, which is, as Tammy mentioned, not easy to do. Okay, last slide. And so this is just kind of an example based on FEMA's community rating system for the National Flood Insurance Program. And that program, if you're not familiar with it, it allocates specific levels of discounts on flood insurance to communities that complete a range of best practices. They're not required, but if you do them and you show that you've done them, you're eligible for a better deal. So this is just kind of an example. The points are just kind of something to consider. But these kind of things, we know they're important for supporting green infrastructure and the co-benefits that come along with them. You could imagine a system where, projects are evaluated and the cost share is based on, the level of completeness on these different elements. This is the kind of thing that could maybe acknowledge work and recognize work by communities like Albuquerque and maybe spur others to do the same. So we'd really be getting ahead of the game and putting our money into places where the work is going to be done and really realize the benefits that we're all so excited about. Very curious. Hope we get some comments and questions on this. But that's all I have for today. And if you can't get them in the time allotted here, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to you more about this. And thanks so much for listening today.
Great. Thanks so much, Pete. That was a really great overview of what EPIC's doing and a little bit on the policy and state and national scales. That's a really big topic, and you broke it down in a really simple and easy to digest way. So thanks for that. So as Pete said, if you have any questions, please keep adding them to the questions box, and we'll get to them in just a couple minutes here. I just wanted to alert everyone to some additional resources. If you're somebody who's working in green infrastructure in any way, if you're a citizen, if you're a practitioner, if you're an academic, here's some resources that might be helpful for you. So I mentioned, for those of you who aren't sure about the state of green infrastructure policy in your community, there's this really great tool that is developed by the Sea Grant University of Wisconsin program. This is tackling barriers to green infrastructure, an audit of local codes and ordinances. And this is really even more than a report. It's really more of a workbook. So you can go in there and it will kind of guide you through the process of doing some research on ordinances in your municipality so that you can have a good idea of what is already in place or what is in progress when you go to make these changes in your community. So the link to that is down in that green box. We'll also be sending out these slides again to all of you who are registered with your email. So you'll be able to, when you get those slides, you can click through this link as well. I also just wanted to let you know that the Southwest Environmental Finance Center has the Integrated Asset Management Framework. And so this is a guidebook for those of you who are practitioners to use to really integrate green infrastructure into your asset management plans. If you don't already have an asset management plan and you're a utility or water, or wastewater, or stormwater system, highly recommend this is what my Environmental Finance Center focuses on. We do a lot of trainings on this. We also have the Green Asset Resource Database, and that database is a really great summary of different types of green stormwater infrastructure, what they can look like, what the relative ease of maintenance and installation and cost are for each of those different types of green stormwater infrastructure. So I'd recommend checking out that database. It's a really great resource. And that link again is in that green box at the bottom of the screen. So at this time, we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm gonna, maybe Pete and Tammy, would you all go ahead and turn your cameras on and maybe unmute also if you feel comfortable doing that. And I'll start kind of sending some questions your way that we got during your presentations today. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to start just from the beginning of the list here and work my way down. So for Tammy, this is a question for you. How are you dealing with issues surrounding gentrification for areas that you're considering for equity areas, they said?
I love that question. Something that I've been really struggling with. So I'll say that for a lot of the areas that I'm looking at these kind of localized infrastructure projects in Albuquerque, they are lower income areas. And so I do want to make sure that we're not gentrifying. I know for sure that property values are going to increase if you're not flooding, right? So how do we balance that out? I've looked at a lot of research. It doesn't seem that the inclusion of green stormwater bump outs or swales in the street in front of your house has that much of an impact on property values. But I think these, because they're pretty, you guys all saw the markups, right? They're going to be really nice. So I do have a concern that it could increase values and lead to gentrification. But I also think that in Albuquerque, I think just geographically, these areas are not areas that we're going to see an influx of more wealthy people in. They're generally lower areas in geographically, so they're not the views of the mountains. They're not in the parts of town that are more desirable for richer folks. And so hopefully we can find a balance. But I do think that you have to partner any kind of policies like this that are bringing benefits to underserved communities with policies that focus on increasing or maintaining affordable housing. So, zoning changes that say we're going to look through ways to get gentle density. This has been a problem in Albuquerque. We've got ADUs approved a couple of years ago, but we can't even get duplexes approved. We need short-term rental limits so that we're maintaining the overall feel of those neighborhoods. These are very quaint, older houses that we want to make sure we maintain. So I love the question. I don't have a super perfect answer, but it's something that we are thinking through now for that next level of policy to make sure that we don't put anyone, any particular areas at risk of being priced out of their own homes.
Yeah, those are all really good points. Pete, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Not particularly. It's a really, really important point, but Tammy, I thought you did a good job explaining the or the reality on the ground for your particular community.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also, I didn't include this this resource in this webinar, but I just also wanted to direct you, Abigail. Our last webinar was particularly on issues of equity in green stormwater infrastructure. So for those of you who are interested in this, and we all really should be, because it's a big concern, especially in urban areas, of what happens when we install green infrastructure and how do we make sure that we're not actually creating more problems for those communities that we're trying to help. So our last webinar that we did is recorded, and it's available online. If you go to the same, wherever you went to register for this webinar, the EFCN website does have previous recorded webinars from the series available. And again, that webinar was on equity issues. And then there's also an equity guide, which I don't know if I'm going to be able to drop it in the chat. I'm sharing my screen right now, so I can't really exit out of it. But if your email is there, Abigail, I can follow up and send you. There's a really thorough and excellent equity guide for green stormwater infrastructure practitioners that goes into this in a bit more detail and kind of talks about, what needs to be in place in order to make sure that we're not displacing people when we go to install green infrastructure. Okay, let's see, what else do we have? It looks like, okay, some people responded to that question that I posed in the chat. Let's see. Oh, thanks, Abigail, for sharing your email there. I'll make sure to follow up with you. There's a question from Kali that I think, well, I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I want to just read it out from Kali Bronson here in Albuquerque. So Kali said, most funding sources are for capital and building projects, but it's much harder to find funding for the maintenance of green stormwater infrastructure. We need to identify funding for maintenance and maintenance training for green stormwater infrastructure, since maintenance for these systems looks pretty different than standard landscape maintenance practices. I'm just curious, Tammy, if you have anything to add to that comment, because I think it's a pretty juicy one.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. For sure, it's hard to raise money for any of these projects, period. But we've raised a substantial amount for that pilot project, but it's all capital money. And so what do we do when we are ready to start maintaining that? And that's really the challenge for like doing way more of these, is getting operating funds, and which means we're going to have to start allocating operating funds in our city budget for this, which is, the capital money came from other sources. And so that's been a little challenging. I am very excited about kind of the process that our amazing staff have come up with on this first pilot project, which is we're actually doing a contract with the installers to do maintenance for a certain period of time. For, I forget if it's 5 years or something like that, so that we get all that maintenance done correctly as the plants are taking root and all of the things that are happening. And then we do have that contract with the GSI professional to really help us train staff to take over that maintenance when we get to that point. So I like that approach. I like that we have an expert who can help train, but I do acknowledge that a substantial barrier will be my ability to negotiate these funds in our city's operating budget.
Right. Yeah, those are all really good points. Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Can I just say one thing about that? Oh yeah, I think that's a good example. Well, obviously there's no simple answer to the maintenance. I think this incorporation of the maintenance costs in the capital project, that's kind of a short term, maybe early, that would help a little bit, but I think this is where really the partnerships are critical in thinking kind of where other funding sources might come into play, like a lot of workforce development programs. How could these maybe be a resource to some of the funds they receive for training be applied to maybe businesses that would help train people. These are the kind of things that I was imagining, like when a city figures out these partnerships and these relationships, this is something that should be considered as a preferential factor, because they've obviously done a lot of work to try to put those things together. And it's not to say that any of it's easy, but I think those kind of connections and integrating it with workforce development programs is really something that has potential, for some communities.
Right, because there's the issue of like passing the ordinance and getting the infrastructure installed, but then there's also, there's a bit more after that too, which is maintaining these pieces of infrastructure that, as Tammy mentioned, it's not like harvesting rainwater or using natural infrastructure is necessarily brand new, but it is kind of in the terms of like city managed stormwater management strategies. So a lot of people are not super familiar with it, and that can present some challenges when it comes to finding people who are trained to maintain it. And then also the funding side of things, like making sure that there is money not just for the installation, the initial capital investment, but also in the maintenance. And I think something that I've noticed from my work, as I've especially looked at kind of that integrated asset management framework where you're managing green stormwater infrastructure as an asset, kind of like pipes and pumps and all of that, is that, the actual, like, the establishment period for plants is minimum 5 years. And if you're only receiving money to install those features and you're not receiving money for those 5 years, that might be considered by some as maintenance, but it's actually like part of the installation process. That's another kind of hitch I've noticed sometimes that cities get caught on is that kind of gray line between, is it part of the capital installation cost or those initial 5 years of establishment, or is that operations and maintenance, and that can be really tricky from a funding standpoint.
If I can just add in, I think in terms of maintenance, I think we at City of Albuquerque acknowledge how important it is that we get this maintenance right, because we're doing a pilot project, right? And if we don't do this one and it's not maintained properly, there is no way the community will buy into additional, and we need a lot of these. And so I think that's just been prioritized in everyone's mind, is this is going to be a successful project. And that means that we have to not only design it properly, install it properly, but we have to maintain it correctly to show that this works and that it's pretty and it's not detracting to the community and that it's actually effective. So it's, I think that's top of mind for all of the experts that are working on the installation, is that it has to be a true pilot that shows the benefits.
Right. Yeah, and that's going to be, now when we really move that forward in Albuquerque, that's going to be we're going to have a really great demonstration and kind of case study for how this can look and how it all goes at a city scale. Okay, I think at this point, it looks like we're almost at time. So I just want to make sure I have a couple of minutes to wrap up a few additional slides here. Thank you, Tammy and Pete, for answering those questions so eloquently. So I just wanted to direct everyone's attention, for those of you who are still here, there's a current series flyer in your handouts tab on GoToWebinar. That's going to have registration links and also dates of upcoming webinars for you. So that's a flyer that I wanted to direct you to. I believe it's in your handouts, or Kristen, did it make it to the handouts tab? Do you know?
It is not in the handouts tab, but I'll drop a link to it right now.
Okay, super. Thanks, Kristen. So it'll be in a link in the chat. And then we're also planning a couple of in-person workshops in Albuquerque. We're still working out the exact dates for these workshops. But if you happen to be Albuquerque based, We're going to look particularly at finding allies and building relationships in regards to green stormwater infrastructure. So those are forthcoming. And this is also a slide to remind you to please fill out the survey for this webinar. You'll receive a survey by email. This is going to really help us out. We've got, let's see, we're 3 down, so we've got 7 more webinars coming up in this series. And we want to make sure that we're delivering information that is clear and that is useful. So please, if you have time, fill out the survey for this webinar that you'll receive in an email link after. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. The next webinar in our Green Infrastructure series is one I'm pretty excited about because this is what I focus on in my work. This is asset management for green infrastructure. That's coming up on January 23rd. Registration is now open for that webinar. So if you want to just hop right over and register for it now, you can do that. If you have any questions directly for me about this webinar or other webinars in this series, please go ahead and email me at the email address that you see on the screen there. I'm available. I'm a resource to you. So go ahead and contact me if you have any questions at all. And I think with that, I'll go ahead and sign out. Thanks again, everyone, for attending today.